over today is some basics of pitching success. And I tried to keep it tailored towards outreach that you would do yourselves or that you could have someone on your team do, and less towards something that you would hire a giant agency to do, since I don't think we're at a stage right now where anybody's going to be, thank you, where anybody's going to be hiring, an Edelman or somebody like that to do a full-scale PR assault on the media right now. We'll leave time for questions at the end, but if you guys have anything that you want me to address as we go along, feel free to interrupt, and we'll jump in as we go. Let's see what we got here. There we go. So basically, what is PR? What do we mean by that? This is your basic definition. We could talk about how the nuances change here, but ultimately, it's about getting the media to write a story in a positive way about your company, your brand, your news. What we tell clients a lot is that PR is a negotiation between what you want an article about you to say and what the reporter wants that article to say. Obviously, there's two agendas there. Sometimes they line up beautifully, sometimes they don't. The negotiation in between to get it as close to your side as possible is sort of what we do and what you're trying to do when you're serving as your own advocate for a media story. So what you can use PR for, there's a whole litany of opportunities, whether you have a product launch, whether you've got FDA news, if you're trying to change market perception of yourself or your industry, reach new customers, revitalize an existing product, or just establish your own expertise and generate curiosity about your brand, which is sometimes code for raise awareness with funders, VCs, and people who have money. Ultimately, your strategy involves 3 steps. We're going to dig into these a little bit more and in more detail and in more plain language, but it's figuring out what messages you want out there about your product, figuring out who you're trying to talk to, and then figuring out what assets you have to tell that story. What makes this important? What details do you have to flesh that out? What can you do to establish a narrative that makes your brand exciting and engaging, not just to this reporter, but to that reporter's readers and his editor and anybody else who's going to see this eventual article. So when we talk about what your story is, it basically falls into elevator pitch, key messages, and proof points. And the elevator pitch is basically what can you say about what you do, what your product does, what your drug does, what your device does in as few words and syllables as possible and in as plain language as possible. Literally, if you had 18 seconds to describe what you're up to, what would you say in those 18 seconds? Because often with a reporter, you're going to have that or even less. Key messages can be a lot of different things, but what they ultimately boil down to is if there's 3 things you want to see about your company, about your brand, about your product in any story, whether it's the Today Show or the New York Times or Becker's Hospital Review, what are those 3 key messages? What are those 3 things that absolutely have to come across in anything anybody writes about you, anywhere, at any time? And once you've boiled those 3 things down, then it's a question of how you communicate those and how you make sure that those get picked up. When we talk about what those stories, what those messages are, a lot of times you want to look at things like what pain points are you trying to solve? How is this better, faster, cheaper than what else is already out there? How does this go in a different direction or revolutionize the field that you're in? Ultimately, you want to get to a point where you establish those with what we call proof points. The evidence that you have to back up that story, the details of that narrative that make it something more colorful for a reporter to write about. And those proof points generally boil down to 3 things that reporters care about, look for, love, and expect, quite frankly. First is stats, studies, numbers. Reporters love numbers of any kind, whether they're your numbers, whether they're third-party numbers. Anytime you can quantify something for a reporter, it telegraphs to them that this is important, this is worth paying attention to. It's almost like a flag for them to put pen to paper. Second is stories or use cases, patients, how this product could be used. And it can be an actual case study, or in some cases, it's just a hypothetical. So this is why this product would be useful. Let me give you an example. A mom and her child suffering from X, bring in this product and everything's all better. Something that illustrates or puts a face on why your product, why your brand, why your company has a value to a specific audience member. And then lastly, KOLs or key opinion leaders and third parties. What we mean by that are basically people who are not you, who believe your story and will go out there and evangelize for you. A lot of times these are clinicians, professors, other people in the professional field who have weight and expertise that's to be trusted and can say, this is wonderful because X. In some cases, it might be a patient. It might be an industry pundit or someone else who otherwise is viewed as an expert opinion in the space and can lend weight and credibility to your story because they're specifically, for lack of a better way of putting it, not you, right? The reporter expects you to think that what you're doing is awesome and great and revolutionary. If you can get one more person to talk about that, then it's another indicator to the reporter that there's something worth following or paying attention to here. I'm a little hasty with that, aggressive with this button. Talking about your audience. This is really basic, but it's important to think about before you go into thinking about targets or outlets or who you want to tell your story. There's basically 4 or 5 audiences that you can point to, but for you guys, it's basically your patients or the everyday consumer. That's clinicians, physicians, administrators, GPOs, anybody else who's in the field but who isn't directly a doctor or somebody who's going to be administering your product or your drug or your work. Investors, potential people who want to support your company in some way, either monetarily or otherwise. And then last is all of them. When you get to these broader mainstream outlets with big eyeballs, a lot of times you're going to hit overlap in these audiences, and a lot of times you want to. But sometimes you've got a story that fits specifically one audience and not another, and we'll talk about how to tailor either that story angle or the place that you go to tell that story and how you tweak the language that you use accordingly. So when we talk about where to go or who to target, there's obviously thousands of media publications and outlets out there, either online, offline, print, broadcast, etc. But they break down into some basic buckets, and I apologize, my giant head's in the way here. Don't worry, we're going to talk through these. First is business press, which is basically mainstream publications that have a business or an industry focus. They're going to talk about why what you're doing matters, why your industry matters, and how that makes money for somebody. And so those are publications like Bloomberg, Financial Times, The Economist, Wall Street Journal. They're going to be looking at you in the context of your industry, your competitive landscape, and the way that this market moves and you move that market. Second is consumer or mainstream media, and this is basically that broad-based media that is going to appeal to the everyday consumer. Stuff that our mom or our brother or our sister or our friend or our neighbor would read and be able to understand. And that's basically anywhere from big glossy outlets, what we call the monthly long leads, like a Self magazine, a Men's Health, an Esquire, a Red Book, Cosmo, etc., to some of those more mainstream daily newspapers like USA Today, and even some online and weekly publications like Slate, Time, Salon, Newsweek is back, etc. Broadcast, I broke out separately. It's very similar to your mainstream media, but because of the medium, it changes the nature of what stories are going to work there and what stories don't. First and foremost, and most obviously, broadcast is always going to want a visual element of some kind, and that doesn't just mean a well-dressed CEO. It means something that they can put on screen in front of a camera that's going to pop or have visual appeal. So for example, broadcast outlets don't really like software products because it's kind of boring to show the screen of iTunes. They do love hardware products. They love things that have some sort of angle or something that's going to pop on camera and catch a reporter or catch an audience member's eye as they're flicking through the channels. And that can be anything from mainstream news channels, regional broadcast news like New York One, Sunday morning shows, and then even specialty shows like The Doctors, Dr. Oz, etc., which we'd all love to be a part of, I'm sure. And then lastly, trade media. These are going to be the outlets that are most familiar with you, that you're most familiar with. The ones that are dedicated to medical news and breakthroughs, they're going to be more likely to cover what we consider softer news than normal. They're not going to need huge medical news. Some places here where FDA approvals, funding news, presentations are going to have more of room for play there. And an opportunity for you to speak. And even there's some distinction. There's a big difference between a fierce biotech or a hardcore vertical trade like a Cath Lab Digest or even a BioIT World, et cetera. But the important thing here is to make sure that you find the core publications that matter to you and identify the reporters and the stories within that are similar to the ones that you're trying to tell. We can talk a little bit about that as well. Everything making sense so far? Any questions? Anything that is throwing anybody off? Now we get to the meat of it. How do you actually do this? What does this do to make sense? How do you, now that you know what your story is and you have an idea of who to come to, how do you actually pitch it and what does a reporter want to see? So basically, when you identify your outlet, you want to consider the timing of your news, the audience that you're trying to take it to, and then the news value or the story angle that you want to go to. If you've got what you think is broad-based consumer news, and oftentimes you're going to want a hook that's going to say, this is a reason why you need to write about this right now. And so for broadcast, that can be the day before or the day of. For some of those magazines that you see on the newsstand, it's 4 to 6 months out. And so when you consider the timeliness of a story, you also need to consider the medium and how often it publishes and how long it takes for them to publish that news. In general, for either an online publication or a weekly publication or a daily publication, we like to go to them 2 to 3 weeks before any news event that we have is going to happen and give them as much information as possible. And there's 2 or 3 ways to do that. The first is through an exclusive, which is you go to a publication, whether it's a trade, whether it's a publication like Time Magazine, or whether it's something in between like a Slate or a New York Times, et cetera, and you say, I'm giving you and only this news. You'll be the only person who gets to write about it. We won't tell anybody else as long as you promise to write about it. And if your news is big enough, they might agree to that and they might run your news as an exclusive. And generally, that's only gonna happen if you have a major breakthrough that nobody else has done before or heard about or even thought of. Big time funding news, in excess of tens of millions of dollars, or some sort of partnership news that with somebody large enough that's going to cause them to blink and pay attention. In general, an exclusive isn't a course we recommend going because you're limiting yourself to one news outlet, one opportunity for eyeballs to stumble upon your story and read about it. But it is something that still happens. The second way to do that, the middle ground, is something called an embargo. Embargo basically means you offer your news to a variety of publications provided they agree to not write about it until a certain date or time. So for example, if you've got funding news, if you've got major product news that you'd like to announce and you want a ton of people to write about it, you want to make sure that they get the story right, but it's got a timing element that's tricky to negotiate, what you do is you'd say, we've got some big news about vague topic, about company growth and direction, about funding, about partnership support, product. Are you interested in hearing about it? Would you agree to not write about it until X date at X time? Call it April 15th at 9 a.m. And if they write back and they say, yes, tell me more, I agree to the embargo, then you share the news with them. And then you offer yourself for a briefing or follow-up call, face-to-face meeting, in some way, share more details of it. They'll say yes, you sit down, you give them all the details, and then you basically hold your breath and pray that no one decides to break that embargo and write about it before the other 10 brands, or publications rather, that have all agreed to that date. This is probably your best bet if you've got hard news for generating a wave of coverage at a specific day and a specific point of time. And when done well, it can cause a wave of momentum that drives traffic to your website, puts you in the news for a couple of days or so, and helps drive some attention to your brand. The second way is just to give the news to anybody and say write about it whenever you want, and you don't hold them to any details or restrictions whatsoever. This is a lot better with softer news, or to work specifically with Run Reporter on a longer story. And this is often what happens when you have softer news. We'll talk about what softer news means and what that looks like, but it's basically when you don't have an actual news that's press release worthy that's going to go out at a specific time. You're just trying to talk to them as a trend or as part of a third-party expertise or as a wrap-up story about your industry in general. So your pitch itself, when you do reach out, no matter what your end game is, should always be short, should always be relevant, should always be clear. And that sounds simple, but when we talk about, for example, concise, we're talking about a paragraph and a half to less. You get at most 4 to 6 sentences before a reporter is going to tune out and go somewhere else. Now, this isn't always with a reporter who knows you well, and sometimes the trade publications will give you a little bit more room in your email to talk about what you're doing, but basically a reporter wants to see 3 things. 1, they want to know that you've read their publication and specifically their work, and that there's a reason that you're reaching out to them. 2, they want to know what your news is or why you want to have a conversation with them and what you hope to get out of it. And 3, they want to know where they can find more information about your company. And really beyond those 3 things, they don't need a lot of excess details. They don't like attachments. They don't want a headshot of your CEO. They don't want excess hyperlinks. They don't want your press release. Actually, in most cases, they never want your press release. So you've got to find a way to convey the most information in the shortest amount of space and in the most straightforward way possible. Reporters are very leery of industry buzzwords, and even the words that you think are specific to your brand or your company may already be being appropriated by others, and it may turn into language that that no longer has any resonance. So I'll give you an example. We have a life sciences client who has a tool that they like to call a decision support platform, which to 8 out of 10 reporters that we're reaching out to has no meaning. And the 2 out of 10 that it does have meaning to have heard that phrase enough over and over and over again that it causes skepticism and not necessarily buy-in from them. So you want to be careful about how you describe yourself, and you want to do it in straightforward language without necessarily losing your point or dumbing down what makes you special and different. Follow-up, if you have a reporter's phone number, they generally will always tell you that they hate phone calls, but it is the fastest way to find out whether or not they're actually interested in your news. If you are able to get a reporter's phone number, some of them list it, some of them don't. We recommend calling in the morning is usually best, at the beginning or the end of the week, because the middle of the week, particularly Wednesdays and Thursdays, is a day that they often have deadlines, particularly if they're a weekly. And we recommend, first and foremost, not leaving a voicemail. Reporters, and I'm going to generalize here and I'll deny it if you tell them, are typically lazy in many cases and not as technology proficient as you might think. So voicemails all too often get ignored. And again, it doesn't really give you information as to how interested they are if they choose not to reply. If a reporter doesn't like your pitch and you leave a voicemail, they're not going to call you back. You're never going to know why they don't like your pitch or what they don't care about or when they might care. So as often as possible, we'll use, we call it, quite frankly, ghost calling. You dial the phone. If they don't pick up, you hit 0, you hang up, you try again, an hour or 2 later. It's a sort of cheap tactic, but honestly, if you're trying to get a reporter on the phone and get that 18 seconds to let them know why you're important, it's often the best and truest way to make sure that you get their time and attention and learn either to bother them with more information or never again. If you do follow up with an email, a lot of times we like to follow up with something relevant. So for example, if you're writing about, we'll talk about allergies later. If you're writing about, that reporter's writing about allergies, you've got an allergy related product, you've pitched them once, they didn't respond. Maybe they write another article about a competitor or about a similar story. You want to maybe follow up and say, hey, we saw your piece last Thursday, saw that you wrote about this aspect, here's a new take that you might not have considered, let us know what you think. In as many cases as possible, you want to tie it back to what's relevant to them, not necessarily hammer them over and over and over again with what you think makes you special. When you actually do get a reporter's interest, typically what happens next is they're going to want to set up a briefing with you, which if they're in the same town, ideally you do face-to-face. If not, often you do it on the phone. You can do it through WebEx if you've got a lot of information, but to be honest, a reporter's, even though they may say yes to WebEx, doesn't necessarily guarantee they're going to pay attention to that information. So it may be easier to send them just a slide or two, a couple of visuals or examples or background information either in advance or just after the call. But as far as your 90-second right here media training goes, the things to remember with a reporter are, one, you don't want to avoid any answers to a question. You can give a vague answer. You can suggest that it's a good question and that you need to get more information and you'll follow up with them later. You can answer the question and move on to another comment. But you don't want to put yourself in a situation where the reporter asks a question and you blatantly either evade it or don't answer it. One thing reporters is smart and thorough. If they don't like the answer that you give to a question, they will often rephrase it and ask that question over and over and over again until they get an answer that they do like. That doesn't mean you have to give them what they want, but you should give them something. A lot of times what we talk about is a tactic called answer plus one, which basically means you've decided in advance what the messages that you have are that are relevant to what topics you want to talk about. They don't all have to be about you and your brand, but about your industry and about the field that you're studying or participating in. And so if a reporter asks a question, you want to give them an answer and then maybe find a way to bridge back to one of those topics or messages that you do want to deliver. So if a reporter says, couldn't this product be dangerous for kids? No, it's actually not dangerous for kids. We take safety very seriously, and we've taken these steps to avoid it. One of the things it's actually great for when you consider children is X, Y, Z. Answer their question, but take it back to something that you actually care about. And then lastly, when we're talking about reporters and briefings, it's okay to ask questions and make it a conversation. A lot of people feel like when they're talking to a reporter, they're at war, they're under fire, they're sitting there and just playing defense the whole time. The reality is the more you turn the interview into a conversation, the better chance it is that a reporter is going to start to warm to your perspective and your side of things, but also that you'll get better feedback on the parts that they are and are not interested in. It's okay when you hear a lot of typing or scribbling on the other end of the phone or the reporter staring off into space after you've answered a question, to ask if that made sense, to follow up with a question of your own, to mention something that they wrote in an earlier piece and bring it back to your conversation if it's germane. Asking questions is a good way to get a reporter to engage with what you're talking about and to give you more feedback about what's relevant to them, what's interesting, what isn't. And if something isn't interesting, then it gives you a chance to either clarify or move on to something that is. Last thing, couple of reporter tactics or tricks to watch out for. Sometimes a reporter will ask a vague question and presume that they don't know or project that they don't know what they're talking about, only to have actually done a ton of research and maybe be setting you up for something. It's rare, but you do want to make sure that you don't take for granted a reporter's intelligence level or familiarity with your product. You don't want to assume that they either know everything or that they know absolutely nothing, and that's another way questions can sort of help set the playing field of their level of knowledge about your space. And then the second thing is just that sometimes a reporter will use silence as a way to push you into talking about things that you're not comfortable with. So if you answer a question once, reporter might not say anything at all. Our human sort of instinct is to fill silence with more talking. It's a great way for reporters to get a quote that might not necessarily be the one that you're looking to give. And lastly, follow through. Don't feel like you have to answer every single reporter question thoroughly right there on the point of the briefing. It's okay to say, let me follow up with more information. It's okay to say, oh, we have a great study that shows more data on that exact point, and follow up with an email or a phone call that has that information or has further information or is a clarification on your point later on. If nothing else, you should follow up after a briefing and make sure they don't have follow-up questions and thank them for their time. And when the coverage actually comes through, it doesn't hurt to show that you noticed it and thank them again, and look for opportunities to offer yourself as further comment for further pieces. The last thing that I'll say about actual discussions and conversations with reporters is that even if you say something is off the record, you shouldn't assume that it is. You should just err on the side that anything you say in front of a reporter is going to get repeated, packaged, and possibly circulated somewhere else. It's safer to think about what you say before you say it and what you say in an email, and just consider that everything that you use, everything you give to a reporter is something that they're going to find a way to use in one way or another. Any questions about actual discussions with reporters? Let's talk a little bit about what a sample pitch looks like. This is a pitch that we used for a client in the diabetes management space. It's relatively straightforward. It's actually a little longer even than most pitches, but it does have some of those elements that we talked about. So it's hi, reporter name. Let's say it's Lena Rao at TechCrunch, for example. We've seen you covered Gluco before. Gluco is the name of the company. In this case, if they've already covered you, it's a little easier to start that conversation, or that you've written about, etc. And here's a place where it's okay to directly reference those articles. A lot of times what I like to do when I'm reaching out to a reporter is find a competitor that they've written about, or find a partner in the space, or find somebody who's most like me that they've already covered. So if it's in this case the diabetes space, I want to find that reporter who's written about diabetes 3, 4, 5 times in the last 6 to 8 months. I want to read those articles. I want to find the one that's most applicable to me. I want to find a reason to show the reporter that A, I've read your work and I'm not just someone who's spamming you. You're not somebody on a list of 100 reporters that I'm sending the same thing out to. And B, I understand the aspects and the angles of this story in this industry, this space, this disease, whatever it is. And I understand what your point is, and I've got a perspective that's valuable that could help deepen your own perspective. But in some cases, you're not going to have a direct corollary. You want to find the closest thing that you can. I saw that you often wrote about, doesn't necessarily have to be diabetes. I saw that you often write about management solutions that people can use to track and pay attention to their disease and have a more informed conversation with their doctor as a result. So find some corollary between what they write about and what you do that's going to let them see a similarity. Not so much that they can say, I've already written this story before, but enough that they can see evidence that you know what they're talking about and you have something similar to show them. Here's what our news is. We're launching a new version of the product. Here's why it's special. It's got more extensive data, better sharing capabilities, and here's what we want. We want you to talk to our CEO next week so he can give you more details about what our news is. Let us know if you're interested. We've shared some bullets below. A lot of times with the things that we're dealing with, you've got a lot of complicated information to communicate. And sometimes, 3.5 sentences just isn't going to get the job done. We have a client right now that does a combination of data science to comb through hundreds of thousands of data points to find, distinct correlations, and genomics to add on top of that to find even more relevant data for patients. Now, those two things are complicated and exciting in and of themselves. When you combine them, you get more than 3.5 sentences of how that works and how we're going to explain it to the health editor at Reader's Digest. So in those cases, sometimes we'll provide some extra bullets or background data below. A lot of times we'll do this with broadcast pitches as well, because a broadcast segment producer is going to want exactly what the news is in one sentence up front, and then bullets to defend why that's worth covering below so when they take it into their morning meeting. So bullets can be a friend. We recommend keeping them below the pitch itself and below your signature line so that it breaks things up and gives a reporter sort of a callback and a reason to talk more, or read more, rather. So that's the pitch at its most basic. I want to talk about a couple of story angles or approaches that make sense. Some things to think about when you figure out what to say when you don't necessarily have hard news. And the first is this idea of thought leadership, which I will admit is a completely overused word, but as a bucket or category to talk about how you can position yourself as an expert when you don't necessarily have things to say about your brand or your company right away can be valuable. And basically the idea here is to figure out topic areas that you or your spokesperson can be considered an expert in. And it doesn't necessarily have to be as narrow as exactly what your product does. It can be things that you can speak to and have a shared perspective on. Things that basically you, as if you were viewed as an expert resource, can, what we say, own, right? So it could be, in the case of diabetes, or in the case of gluco rather, it can be, all right, we're experts on diabetes. Anytime anybody is writing an article about diabetes and solutions for diabetes, we should be quoted in that article. That's something that we have unique perspective to share and is worthy of sharing and worthy of being in print. The evolution of biotech. We as Gluco, obviously have a unique perspective on where biotech is going. We're a biotech company. Let's talk about making sure that anytime somebody's writing about the biotech industry, we can be used as an example or a proof point to that story about trends in biotech. Or, one that reporters love is anything that deals with current events. So for example, Chris Weaver at the Wall Street Journal cared about two things for all of last year, which was the impact of the Affordable Care Act on hospitals and drug companies and medical device companies and really anyone in the healthcare industry, or how marketing was evolving and changing in the hospital and healthcare space. So if you had any kind of perspective that you could share on those two topics, because those were two current events he was required by editors to write on over and over and over again, he was looking for an opportunity to get unique perspective on that. A lot of the times, especially at these larger publications, reporters have stories or trends or angles that they're going to have to write about over and over and over again. You see it, the most glaring example, if not the most relevant, is what you see in the long lead glossy magazines, right? Every single sort of women's glossy in that, Good Housekeeping, Family Circle, et cetera, is gonna have a back to school issue with 8 back to school articles about it, right? There's always gonna be, in Cosmo, you read it for a year, you're gonna see the same 5 articles pop up over and over and over again, right? You see it in broadcast cycles as well, right? Every December, there's going to be a best of 2013 wrap up, no matter whether the publication is Wired or Time or, like I said, Working Mother. Every January, there's going to be a trends to watch for the coming year ahead, whether it's Inc. or Harvard Business Review or Esquire magazine. So look for those opportunities in the news cycle where things actually make sense to you. And it might not be those larger topics, but it might be something like flu season. It might be something like travel season. Every single outlet almost in the world is going to write about travel between Thanksgiving and New Year's. What do you have to say about travel that might make sense as far as germs go, et cetera? Basically what you want to do is scan the news for these issues response opportunities. You want to look to see which reporters are writing about these stories over and over and over again. When they are writing about it, you can call or email and say, hey, we've seen you written about this. This is something we have perspective on. Here's why we think X is important. And we'll talk through a couple of examples of what that looks like later as well. The biggest thing in this is to think of yourself as a subject matter expert, not a mycompany.com expert, right? A reporter doesn't necessarily want to hear about why your company or you specifically or your product or your solution is amazing and perfect for everything. What they're looking for is you to be an expert on that larger topic. So when you're talking about, let's say it's the evolution of biotech companies in New York and you're talking to Economy, they don't necessarily want to hear about why your company is awesome. They want to hear about why being a biotech company in today's climate, or in New York specifically, is different, and what your perspective is on growing a company and a brand in that client, and then maybe some examples from your specific experience that bolster that larger point. They don't necessarily want to hear the history of your company from 2004 to present. And then the last thing is to look for guest blog posts and column opportunities. One of the interesting things about online media specifically is that because there's pressure from these editors to have a constantly fresh stream of content, they don't necessarily always have, these days in particular, a full newsroom to generate all that content. So if you've got a unique perspective, be prepared to not only offer yourself as a briefing for somebody else to write an article, but to offer to write that article yourself. Excuse me. In the trade publications in particular, byline articles are another way, written by your KOL or you, where these publications generate a steady stream of content and you can get your perspective in there almost unedited. Excuse me. We're talking about publicizing research. There are some tricks of the trade, either at shows, before, or just beyond, that you can use to make sure that you get the word out there. Sometimes it's as simple as, if you have a press release that you're going to be announcing something at a show, make sure that you find the media room at that show. Most of them have them. Talk to somebody at the door there. Ask if you can leave a couple of copies of your press release there. You know, it's a simple case in that case of fishing where the fish are. If the media are going to be in that room and you've got hard news, print it out, ask somebody, get permission to leave it there, make sure your contact information is on it, and it's low-hanging fruit for the reporter to write that up and you to get a chance at a story. You want to coordinate. A lot of the times these bigger conferences and some of these journals have their own media teams to publicize what's going on and what's special about their show particularly. You want to find out who these contacts are, reach out to them, find out who else is going to be there. A lot of times conferences will have what they call a pre-registered media list. Sometimes you don't even need it because the same press people show up over and over and over again. You want to find out if those people are going to be at the show, send them an email, give them a call and just say, hey, we're going to be at the show too. You know, we've got a couple of new things that we're going to be talking about. Would love to grab coffee and talk about it with you while we're both in the same place at the same time. A lot of times presence is almost, in some cases, the one thing a reporter, that will push a reporter over the edge to say yes. There's an old tactic we used to use, particularly with business publications, where you talk to a reporter on the phone, let's say they're in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., et cetera, and when they professed any interest whatsoever in your story, we'd say, oh, actually our CEO is going to be in Washington, D.C. next week. You guys should meet up for coffee while he's in town. And then you'd hang up the phone, and if the guy said yes, you'd tell your CEO, book a train ticket to Washington, D.C. to be there next week to meet with a reporter. You don't want to do that all the time. It's kind of an expensive coffee date. But if it's high profile enough and your news is important enough, it's a simple tactic, and it's an illustration of that larger point of face-to-face will often get you a little bit farther than a phone call or an email will. And then lastly, For peer-reviewed publications, you want to supplement that media list with reporters who focus on those specific things. What I would recommend is when you're talking about trade media or your core publications in particular, get to know the managing editor and the core couple of reporters that work there and write there on a daily basis. And those are situations where either through an email, through careful study, or even through a phone call, you can be a little bit more open about asking them, what kind of stories are you looking to write? What trends are you interested in? What things do you think are absolute bunk and don't want to spend your time on but get forced to by your editor? Asking some questions to make sure, again, framing it as, I want to make sure that I don't bother you with things that you don't care about. I want to give you the information and the news and the stories that you are looking to tell. Will go a long way towards getting a reporter to open up and build a relationship and maybe answer that next phone call or read that next email. And then lastly, this idea of building an infrastructure for success. I know that you all have day jobs, and so does your team. You don't necessarily have time to go out and read publications for 3 hours a day and then call a bunch of reporters and get hung up on by half of them and maybe meet for coffee with the other half that don't. But there are some things that you can do that can help shortcut that process and make sure that you don't miss out on opportunities. And the first and easiest is looking at what we call editorial calendars. A lot of these publications, from bigger glossies like Wired Magazine all the way down to smaller trades like Fierce Biotech, have what they call editorial calendars. And what that is basically a calendar of month by month, the 2 or 3 big stories that they're going to be writing about or covering in each issue. A lot of times what they use that for is advertising, because if they're going to have a med device issue, that they write a big cover story on med devices, that means they can go all the med device companies and sell them advertising space in that issue that's special just for them. But it also does mean that there's an editorial opportunity there. And while you won't be buying advertising space, you can use that calendar to get an idea of the topics they'll be covering and find out which reporters are going to be writing the actual article and when their deadline is. A lot of times it's as simple as emailing the managing editor and saying, hey, saw that the June issue is going to have a piece on biomarkers and healthcare IT. Who's going to be writing that and what's the deadline? And then they'll write back, they'll tell you who it is, you'll get the reporter's name, you can reach out, and now you've already got the idea of when he's writing his piece and a little bit maybe more on the focus of what that piece is going to be and maybe how you could fit into that. Second thing is to build a media list of core influencers that you follow on a regular basis. Twitter's made this a lot easier. Most reporters, I'll say, let's call it 60 to 75% of them, have some sort of social media presence, usually through Twitter, sometimes through LinkedIn, rarer and rarer these days through Facebook. But if a reporter's going to go out on Twitter and talk about what they're doing all day long, every day, and it's a reporter that's core important to you, not necessarily Katie Couric, but maybe somebody a little closer to home for the things that they're writing about that pertain to you or your industry every day, it behooves you to follow them and pay attention to what they're writing about. It might not always be relevant, but it may, 1, give you an entry point to break the ice, or 2, help you figure out when they're busiest. A lot of the times, particularly for the tech journalists who tend to be very prolific and write on a rapid basis, and some of those business press journalists as well, what we'll do is actually time our pitches to when we see them tweeting. You've got your pitch out, you're ready to go, it's tailored, you want to make sure that they're there in front of their inbox to read it. Well, if they just tweeted 3 times in the last 8 minutes, chances are they're in front of their computer and they'll be there when you hit send and the email comes across. It's, again, kind of a weird and a cheap tactic, but these are things to think about when making sure that you take that one chance and you maximize the opportunity for that chance to come through for a reporter. And then lastly, what I'd say is when you do have hard news, make sure you're packaging it for maximum impact. Make sure that you're thinking about what you're going to do, who you're going to pitch before that news goes out, during that news going out, and then what the follow-through is afterwards, so you can demonstrate that you've got more to come and more going on than just that one spike of something that's happened. Any questions or thoughts before we jump into a couple of examples? All right, I thought we'd look at 2 examples from things we've done, and then maybe we'd look at things that we could talk about for a couple of you guys. First things first, a company we just started working with called Cellmatics. Cellmatics is in the fertility space. Basically what they do is they're building tools. One is a data science tool to go through all the information that's currently available from clinical data about fertility and find specifically the options that make best sense for treatment for a specific individual. It goes through at a deeper level than what typically fertility doctors either have available or do right now. The second facet of what they're doing is using genomics to get specific biological biomarker information and then dig in a little bit more and add that to that data to become a little bit more, even more accurate and even better predictor of what treatment options will work. The bottom line is they're going out right now on a funding push, so they want to talk to not necessarily any of the biotech or healthcare journalists, but they want to talk to as many tech and business press journalists as possible. So what we did there was we, yes, position the brand as a breakthrough in the space, which doesn't really mean a whole lot without data or proof points or backup. But what we tried to do is leverage these two trends in tech press, two things that they already care about, which is this idea of genomics and this idea of big data, and show that because we were applying both of these to a new process that would result in better options for women and couples, that we've got something really particularly interesting. You're writing about these issues already. We have a new application of these issues that you'd be interested in. And then we pointed as much as we could to hard news, in this case, an upcoming clinical study and some partnerships with major fertility clinics as a reason to write now. A lot of times you can have the most interesting story in the world, but if there's no reason why a reporter has to write about it that day, that week, that month, it's the kind of thing that they can put in a file and say, I'll write about this when I have time. And the scary thing is reporters rarely have time and come back to that. So what you want to do is you want to give them a reason. This is why you have to write the story now, before it gets old, before somebody else writes about it, before you're behind the curve. So in this case, we didn't have something hard and firm and fun as a product announcement or funding news, but we did have a couple of things to point to that would make this a timely story. The second thing that we did is CEO of this company has a relatively interesting origin story of how she even came into fertility and then how she came up with the idea for this product. The fact that it is also a female CEO in the fertility space who is pregnant as she's going out on this funding tour adds a slightly interesting human interest angle to it. And so we looked for opportunities to work those details in when it was appropriate, not necessarily with bio-IT world, but certainly with reporters who are interested in sort of an interesting background story, like the person we went to at the Wall Street Journal. And what this turned into after 2 weeks of sort of furious pitching was a briefing with the Wall Street Journal, an upcoming piece about women to watch in Inc. magazine, and a couple of briefings with some tech outlets, including Wakefield and GigaOM, and interest from Businessweek, bio-IT World, and Fios One, which is a Long Island broadcast affiliate. And we're going to be announcing a partnership with a Long Island fertility clinic that gives them a local angle and a reason to cover this. But the idea here, again, was to find some things that reporters were already writing about. So anybody who wrote about other fertility products or tech tools like Ovuline or Glow, we were looking for those reporters and saying, hey, we've seen you written about Ovuline earlier this summer, and we know that you've covered Glow a couple of times. We've got something that takes a completely different approach that's a little farther down the road than those products, and we'd like to talk to you about why this is important. And that, again, showing them the connection between what they've already written about and what they could write now, resulted in at least some interest and responses and some early coverage. Second, Gluco, we talked about before. This is an interesting company because they'd made the mistake of chasing themselves too far down into the app world, so they were seen as simply an app. It basically is a product that links your blood sugar meter with your cell phone and then captures not only that blood sugar information but diet and exercise. They also have a tool to make sure that that information gets to your practitioner. They wanted to skew away from app and more towards a diabetes management solution, which is a fun word, but not necessarily if you're a reporter and want to cover it. So what we did here is we played into a couple of larger trends. First, this idea of the intersection between the Silicon Valley startup world and the traditional healthcare world, and how companies like Gluco were sort of forging a balance or a hybrid between the two that positioned them as something different than what some of these reporters had seen before, and gave us a reason to go to not just our traditional healthcare audience, but some of that technology and that startup world that might not otherwise have been off limits. The second thing that we did was we used proof points. We had great data that we could point to that showed that using a product like Gluco would result in better adherence and better outcomes overall. But we also had a partner in Scripps Health that was implementing a pilot program. And because that gave them real people and real clinicians who were using this product, all of a sudden there were third parties involved and a little extra credibility than the story we tried to tell without that in place, excuse me, 6 months ago. And so what that resulted in was not just a wave of interest from these publications that had previously not really shown or paid gluco any mind, including MedGadget, Graysheet, Mass Device, but also some larger opportunities with business publications like the Wall Street Journal and The Economist that all of a sudden didn't see this as just another app, but saw it as a solution for the healthcare industry with a technology bent that might otherwise break through where some previous products had not. Any thoughts or questions about those? I thought what we do is talk as a group. I was here a couple of weeks ago and I got to see a few of you present sort of or practice for the demo day that you had last Monday and talk about what your companies did. I picked two, Immunovent and Expunge, that I thought were relatively broad enough to be interesting that we talk a little bit about how we would pitch these to different media and what stories and audiences these could be valuable for. Now, so for Immunovent, which I don't know if they're there here, but I believe basically is a new way to test for allergies that doesn't involve either the prick test or taking blood, and therefore makes it more accessible to particularly young children. I think that's a company that's got an angle that's doesn't just work for that trade media or that science and the healthcare level, but also at a larger level, some of these larger glossy business press and even some mainstream media technology or media press that we could go after. So for example, right now, allergies is a current event and a trend story that all of these glossies are going to be writing about, that broadcast outlets are going to be talking about, that even publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today are going to be discussing. Now, broadcast and women's health might not necessarily be the right audience from a timing perspective. Women's health because it's 6 months lead time. Broadcast because this company isn't particularly at a stage where broadcast coverage, say here locally, would do a whole lot to push their brand forward in a meaningful way other than grab some eyeballs. But going to a publication like, say, some of the Wired Science or Health blogs, or something like Slate Magazine that talks about sort of these issues, not just from a parent's perspective, but from a health and science perspective, could be an opportunity to grab eyeballs that might not otherwise see this brand at a time when they're maybe paying a little bit more attention to allergies than they might not during the summertime or the winter, for example. And there were some great stats and story examples, I think, from that meeting or from that presentation that I saw a couple of weeks ago that I thought would resonate and make sense. There was one particular one about the accuracy of their test for peanut allergies versus the industry standard. That's the kind of thing that's a great use case example of not just using a number, but here's something that particularly ties to something that's familiar to that audience and helps relate why this product is better at a pretty basic and straightforward level. And then secondly, I thought Expunge was an interesting example because it talks about a couple of things that you see show up in the press over and over again from an issues response perspective, where they could offer themselves as an expert resource, talking about the increasing resistance of antibiotics, or the product development process from a CPG company's perspective and how they interact with science and technology to develop new products. These are two areas where this company could position themselves as an expert resource and not necessarily talk directly about themselves, but show that they're subject matter experts in two topics that might get talked about more often in the mainstream press than specifically the product development pipeline for a biotech company based out of a community space in Harlem. This is a situation where they can dial up to a larger trend and then help bring that audience back down and closer to the things that are near and dear to that particular company's heart. Does that make sense? Does anybody have questions about maybe their own company and how you could tell these stories? Anything I left out?
You know what I was thinking? Some of the universities have very excellent, some of the universities have really excellent sort of press communicators.
Yep.
And I know one that is likely, I don't know if they were one of the best, is UCSF. Because we had a big asthma story published in Science, and their press release made this go in all journals. We got them all on the phone. We never had any prompting on how we would do that. But because we just told our story, we got it Wall Street Journal on the first page, below the bend, New York Times, Boston Globe, every journal, every newspaper in Europe, every newspaper in South America, and that made the push to actually go from a mouse experiment that looked wonderful to make pharmaceutical companies actually be so interested that they used and already that molecule was deemed to be dead for a pharmaceutical company, because several pharmaceutical companies actually looked at it. They steered enough interest for the pharmaceutical companies to pick it back up. And they used all these points that you actually made right now. But the way UCSF does it, they have this press release every week where they essentially summarize the newest, best points of all the research coming out of UCSF. And each of the big journals actually have science writers. So they have used this for the last 15 years. They go the press release must just be like half a page or something. And so they go through and then decide if they want to cover it.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a couple of things that are great examples of how this can work, right? The first is, basically what UCSF did was they positioned themselves as that expert resource that we talked about trying to package yourself of. Now they have the weight of being a university behind them, but they basically said, every week we're going to show you a couple of things that we think have value to your audience, and we'll make sure that you have them, and eventually you can turn to us as a resource for that information if you want more of it. And so they were able to turn what's usually a proactive relationship, right, where you call the reporter and beg them to cover you, into a reactive one where they said, we're going to keep giving you information, and when you see something you like, you'll come to us. And ideally, that's the kind of back and forth that you want to have. The second thing, and forgive me for paraphrasing here, but it sounds like there was a little bit of a contrarian story there, right? And that's something that I think especially you guys can talk to, right? You're not building biotech companies in the traditional way that reporters in this industry is used to. You're not, in many cases, if you are, looking for hundreds of millions of dollars and 15 years before anybody can hopefully see some value out of here. You're trying to do it leaner, faster, quicker, and better. So you can take that as a contrarian story that some of these reporters aren't used to. So for example, when we went to the Wall Street Journal, part of the story we told there was sort of positioned Cellmatics as more of a tech startup than a traditional biotech, which was when they first went to investors, they had a business plan that said, give us hundreds of millions of dollars in 15 years and we'll turn this around, et cetera. And the investor said, actually, we need you to do it much leaner. And because they were at a point where they were literally couch surfing and eating ham sandwiches every day, they had to cut back and form sort of what they consider a very lean version of what a biotech typically was. And that story or that framework, that different than the way you've heard it before angle, was something that caught the reporter's eye and caused him to pay a little bit more of attention than he might have otherwise done. And then I think just one of the things that your point reminded me of was also when we talk about being an expert, we talk about being a resource, it doesn't just have to weigh on your company as an expert. A lot of times you can do roundup articles where you point to yourself and a couple of similar companies in your space or in related spaces to give the reporter a fuller story than he might otherwise get than just your narrow band of what you're talking about. Reporters, we've all read the stories in any publication, love lists of any kind. So anytime you can say, here's 5 New York City biotechs that are changing these industries, then you're giving a reporter an opportunity to not just tell your story, but the story of the people who are maybe sitting next to you in this room, and in a way that gives them a fuller piece than they might otherwise get. And that's something that most reporters who like to have some of that legwork done for them will be receptive to. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes.
Bloggers?
Yes, and I didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
So I have bloggers in red on there. And the reality is, bloggers is kind of a tricky word because bloggers can mean, my brother writing in my parents' basement, he really does live there, or, the New York Times and Tara Parker Pope, or somebody like Ed Silverman at Farm-A-Lot. And there's obviously a big difference and a big spectrum in the folks that exist in between there. But if I had to give some general thoughts on bloggers and specifically maybe towards that lower tier and not towards that more formalized, basically media tier, I would say that you want to read even more of their posts and even more of the things that they write about and hit even closer to home for them than you would a traditional journalist. And you also want to make sure that you're looking at opportunities to treat them as something more than just a place to get a link back to your website or a place for them to write something about you. A lot of times what you can do is build a relationship with a blogger where they're not just writing one blog post about you, but they turn into a resource for you just as much as you turn into a resource for them, which can result in guest blog post opportunities, which can result in using them as some of your subject matter experts or third parties who add credibility to those more mainstream stories. One thing that we used to love to do was develop a relationship with a blogger, have them write about why our brand was important, and then turn around when we're talking to the New York Times and offer that blogger as a resource for the reporter to talk to, because that blogger is seen as an expert in their space, or in some cases, particularly in this field, a patient or the parent of a patient or something similar.
So what do you think about having an in-house blog for Harlem Biospace? Because the perspective is really unique. Mm-hmm. And so how would you, biggest issue of having a blog is like getting eyeballs.
Right.
So in terms of getting eyeballs, do you think it's a better idea for someone in the incubator to write the stories and get eyeballs, or the opposite, the exact opposite approach of pitching to newspapers?
Yeah, so is that
a better approach?
It's a really good question. Here's what I would say. If you're going to have your own blog, whether it's Harlem Biospace or your company or whatever, the important thing to remember is two things. One, it's a tremendous investment in generating a steady stream of content, because like you said, if you're trying to get eyeballs, not only do you have to have content that's interesting and valuable, but you also have to create a scenario where you give people a reason to come back. And to give people a reason to come back, the first thing you need to be is interesting. The second thing you need to be is consistent. So you can't go on your honeymoon or get sick for a month and not have a post go up. And then you can't say, I'm gonna be here every Tuesday and Thursday and do 2 blog posts a week, and all of a sudden it's 1 every other week. Once you create that expectation that there's gonna be content there, you need to deliver every time.
It's like that UCSF.
Right. They can't say no newsletter this week. The Wire was really good and we had to catch up on season 7, right? It doesn't work that way.
There was an earthquake this week, and
Yes.
no data.
Right, and so no data. Like a lot of times when we're doing any kind of social channel with a client, the first thing that we do is create a calendar. The second thing that we do is create literally a library of content. So if there's ever a week where we're short or something happens, you've got sort of a backlog of ready-made stuff that can go out there. It's always going to be easier to pitch somebody else's source and then link back to it than it is to create that. But if you do have the resources and the time and the passion to do it, then I would say absolutely do it. Just make sure that you've built an infrastructure to support it.
Thank you.
No problem. My contact information is here. I'll make sure that Matt has it. I think he does already. If you guys have any questions, either specific or ad hoc now or in the future as they come up, I'm happy to talk shop. Feel free to reach out. Thanks, guys.